Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxty. Today we are delighted to welcome the Conservative peer and British statesman, Lord Peter Lilley. Lord Lilley served as Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, as well as Secretary of State for Social Security. He later served as Shadow Chancellor and Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party. Lord Lilley, welcome to Brexit Watch.
Good to be here.
Now, getting straight into things, Peter, we've obviously just passed the point of the beginning of the easing of the lockdown. We saw Super Saturday passed on the 4th of July. And in the next few months, we're also going to see the unwinding of the furlough scheme. What has been your overall assessment of how the government has handled the coronavirus crisis and how it's handling some of the economic consequences right now?
Well, doubtless it could have done better, but it's important to distinguish between things we now know that perhaps should have been done differently and things they didn't know at the beginning. And there'll be an opportunity for a proper learning of lessons. And it's more important, I think, to learn lessons than to cast blame. I think there are quite a lot of lessons to learn. Doubtless one should challenge scientists, one should challenge models. But it's easy to say that. In which direction should we challenge them? Should they have been challenged? More important is to learn the systemic weaknesses that the British governmental system has displayed during the process, which have been pretty worrying. Not just lack of preparation, but inability to respond speedily, to organize large projects, to meet targets and so on, to involve the private sector. All those weaknesses need to be addressed in the medium term, without necessarily saying someone was to blame and someone wasn't to blame, but now we know we've got to do something about it.
Peter, in terms of the economic handling of the crisis, as I mentioned, we've had the furlough scheme that's due to be unwound, coming to an end over the course of the next few months. We've had loans given out. We've had new measures being announced recently by the Treasury. I believe the Chancellor will be speaking on Wednesday. That by the time this broadcast airs, that may have already happened. Already we've heard talk of a 5 billion sort of so-called British New Deal. Bill, the Prime Minister says. We've also heard about this new package of £3 billion for green jobs. Do you think this is enough, or do you think this is going to be a drop in the ocean compared to what will be required to get the UK out of this?
Well, I think they can be criticised for not having started focusing on the economic recovery sooner. The key to this recession is it's different from all previous ones. All previous ones were caused by inadequate demand. And this was caused by suppression of supply. People couldn't run their businesses. And so activity dropped precipitately. To get out of it, therefore, we don't need to create demand, we need to liberate supply. And that depends, first of all, on reducing, or as soon as possible, abolishing the physical distancing law from 2 meters to 1 meter, and where possible, not having such restriction at all. Secondly, getting rid of this absurd quarantine rule, which simply stops people coming to this country, some of whom will generate business, both themselves and if they're business people, in terms of activity with the UK. And thirdly, getting schools back and up and running, and they should have been back and up and running before the holidays, not afterwards, so that the parents are freer to go back to work. Those three things will do an awful lot, and I think we'll find that the initial recovery is much more rapid than people anticipated. So it'll be a fairly steep uptick on the V-shaped recovery, but there are lots of reasons to suppose it won't go back as high as it was before it went on the down slope of the V collapse, because some activities will no longer be profitable, or not on the scale they were before. Fewer people will travel. The airline industry and the aircraft industry are shedding jobs. Some parts of the hospitality industry and entertainment industry may not be able fully to recover and will shed jobs. And even those companies which do go back to the former level of production may have used this opportunity to think, oh, well, we can do that with fewer people. Now, in the long run, doing more with less is increasing productivity. It's good. But in the short run, we've got to have jobs for those additional people. And so that brings me to the third thing the government ought to be doing, which is trying to speed up the processes through which people have to go when they start new businesses or extending existing businesses. And we learned during the COVID pandemic and the slowdown, the shutdown, that actually under pressure of public opinion, the public's regulatory bodies can suddenly take decisions in days or weeks, which previously took months or years. So we should say to all regulatory bodies in the government system, you in future have got to report how long you take to take decisions. You've got to report to Parliamentary Select Committee, you've got to report in public, you've got to do so every 6 months, and you've got to find ways of bringing down the time it takes to get a decision. Whether that decision be positive or negative is a different matter, but sooner businesses can get a decision as whether they can build, whether they can get environmental approval for this, whether they can even sack a manager who's been hopeless and replace him by somebody else. All those decisions need to be speeded up. At present, they take months or years, and they need to take weeks. And then if they also introduce tax cuts which are time limited, then that will bring forward activity to the point we need it now.
Peter, it sounds as if you think there can be some positives come out of the crisis. I mean, I often liken the world economy and even the domestic economy to a spider's web. You know, one bit connects to another. I've often made the point in these broadcasts that unless and until a country's trading partners come back online, as it were, any given country will remain stuck in second gear economically. We've seen even with Sweden, a country that didn't lock down like other countries, it has suffered economically just because it has such an export-oriented economy. We know that supply chains have been disrupted heavily from this, upended by this crisis. We obviously, there is a bit of a talk of a potential reset with China. Do you see some wider economic implications, international implications for this, for what has happened? Do you see an opportunity for reshoring or onshoring critical industry for the UK?
I don't think we should set about doing so systematically and trying to sort of make everything here. We should take advantage of making things we do best and importing other things from countries which have particular speciality in that line. But there's no doubt that some companies will learn what more prudent companies knew anyway, that over-reliance on a single supplier, particularly a distant single supplier, can be unwise, and will therefore want to diversify and perhaps have some domestic production as well as some overseas suppliers. And we'll see that just out of people learning from experience. We don't need particularly to have a government policy. There may be particular strategic industries which we always will want to keep to ourselves, though there's no particular reason why we should have learned about that during the COVID system. I don't think the ability to make face masks is a strategic need, but it is a particular revelation to find that we had such little capacity in the UK for doing so, and even that we have to send some of our tests for the COVID virus over to Germany to be analysed. I'm surprised we haven't got the laboratories and so on in this country, and we ought to be looking to see why not, and whether there are regulatory problems that need to be overcome to enable those domestic suppliers to expand and grow.
Before we go on to Brexit, just one final question on the crisis. Do you think we will see a reset between China and the Western world because of what has happened?
No, there is clearly a political reset going on in the minds of governmental elites in particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, but it probably spread a bit further. I'm a little cautious about this. Obviously, we don't want to make ourselves beholden to or dependent upon the Communist Chinese government. But in general, trade, as I think Cobden said, trade is God's diplomacy. It's better to trade with people you don't see eye to eye with than to try and isolate them, because trade means exchanges, and they'll see the merits of your system and the weaknesses of their own. So I hope we don't go too far in the direction of sort of cutting them off and treating them as a pariah.
But obviously, if there are instances where, as you alluded to, where the UK needs to bring back some critical industry, perhaps an area where it makes sense to have more capacity here, that may be something to consider.
Yes, and if the security services have convincing reasons to believe that Huawei or dependence on Huawei is a security risk, then obviously that's not a risk we should take. I'm not in a position to evaluate that, but clearly the security services in countries like Australia and New Zealand, as well as America, have reached that decision, and we ought therefore to take it quite seriously.
Now, Peter, leaving the coronavirus crisis aside for the time being, let's move on to Brexit. Currently the UK and the EU are in this transition negotiation. During this period, the UK is in the single market and the customs union. No longer has any representation in the European Parliament. This is due to end at the end of the year. We've just passed a point in late June where the UK or the EU could have asked for an extension to the transition period. That moment has now passed. First question, what has been your overall assessment of how the negotiations have gone? Second question, connected to the first, do you believe the passing of the transition deadline will focus minds, particularly in Brussels?
Well, answering your second question first, yes, it was absolutely right to insist on meeting the original deadline rather than giving them a reason to prevaricate. We at present pay £1 billion a month net to the European Union. If we were to leave with no deal, our exporters would have to pay tariffs costing £500 million a month. Now, the idea of paying £1 billion a month to avoid a cost of £500 million a month suggests some people are arithmetically challenged. So it was right to do this. It's concentrated minds already. The EU is beginning to look somewhat more flexible. What was your first question?
First question was, what has been your overall assessment of how the negotiations have gone thus far? Perhaps also I could add to that, now you've said that, add to that, how do you think they are going to go from here to the end of December?
Well, I think the way they've been carried out has been a breath of fresh air. When dealing with the EU, and I've had to deal with the EU for many years as a minister, you have to negotiate on the front foot. You have to come forward with your proposals. You have to have a clear rationale for what you want to do. And David Frost and his team have done both those things. They put forward a concrete draft treaty that we would like. They've put forward a coherent reason and analysis so that the other side can't make all the running and can't pretend that they don't know where we stand. And if they keep that approach, then I'm sure the chances of a sensible deal are much greater than they would otherwise be. For the last 4 years, I've been one of those saying no deal is much more likely than most people imagine, but much less damaging than most people try to make us believe. I now think, on the whole, it's more likely we will end up with a reasonable free trade deal and associated deals than not. Certainly, it's at least 50-50 chance that we will get a sensible deal. And that's partly because the EU actually does like deals. It prefers to, if it puts someone in charge of negotiating, they expects them to reach a conclusion. And Mr. Barnier might well like to be a future Prime Minister of France. And he'd probably be more likely to do that if he's seen to have achieved something rather than failed to achieve something. So I think they're probably, or at least as likely as not, will be a reasonable Canada-style free trade deal with associated agreements on fisheries and transport.
Peter, just to pick up on something you said, you mentioned the prospect of no deal, despite your belief that one will eventually materialise. Some people listening to us would say that no deal, or a so-called World Trade Organization WTO exit or Brexit, considering especially what the UK has just been through with the coronavirus crisis, that would be a real, worst case scenario. What would you say to those people? Is a WTO Brexit really that damaging, or would it actually not be a problem for the UK?
It would be better to have a deal than no deal. Better to have no tariffs than to have tariffs. Better to have few barriers than reinstate all the old barriers. But people on both sides of the argument, and whether they're talking about Britain, EU, or Britain, rest of the world, exaggerate the importance of trade deals. It so happened that I was the Secretary of State for Trade and Industry at the time we negotiated the Uruguay round, which set up the WTO, and also at the time we set up the single market, and I had to introduce all the measures that made us part of the single market. I made speeches about both of them, saying how wonderful they would be at boosting British exports. Looking back, I can see that I was, to say the least, over-optimistic. Our trade with the single market, which is supposedly the most comprehensive, deep, profound removal of barriers that's ever occurred, has, over the last quarter of a century, little more than stagnated. It's grown at about 0.5% a year. Whereas the economies with which we're trading have grown, faster than that. So our share of their economies has actually been falling, even though other countries have increased their share of those markets. Our trade under WTO terms, with taking the 14 largest countries with which we trade on WTO terms, which are not different in total amount of trade to the 14 countries which were originally part of the single market, European single market, has grown 6 times as fast, 3.5% per annum. But even that is less than I anticipated, and it shows that though trade deals are worth having, I would like to have them, I would like to remove tariffs wherever possible, we shouldn't think that that's the primary driver of trade. What drives trade is producing goods and services that other people want to buy and getting out and selling them at a competitive price. And better to have a free trade deal than none, but Germany, for example, has massive exports to China, but has no free trade deal with China. Our trade with China is rising and has increased enormously, but it would be better if we could remove further barriers, but only if we've got things to sell and services to offer will we prosper. And that's why the real gains of Brexit are firstly our ability to change our regulatory system to make our industries more competitive, and secondly, a psychological benefit, which no one talks about. And that is that when we've left the EU, we'll no longer be able to blame the EU for all our problems, and no longer be able to look to the EU for the solution to all our problems. Our problems will be of our own making and for our own solution. And that will be tremendously important, psychologically and in terms of generating a different mindset in governments, that we'll just have to get on and make this country more competitive, improve our educational and training system, which we could have done within the EU. But we won't really do so until we realize that it's up to us and not up to others to solve our problems.
Peter, it's interesting you mentioned trade deals. I do want to touch back again on the transition negotiations, but we spoke a little bit about trade deals. I'd like to go into that. It's interesting for a start. You said what really matters is producing stuff that the other countries want. At the risk of doing a bit of self-promotion, I hope I'm forgiven for this. My latest article for the Telegraph, I actually made the point that the pandemic could be used as a moment and for post-Brexit Britain to sort of rejuvenate its economy, to actually look for the growth technologies of the next century. You and I share an alma mater, and I often say the UK has the best higher education system on earth outside the United States, and really could utilize that. It's utilized to a great degree now, but it could be utilized even more, I think. So taking that into account, you mentioned trade deals. The UK is currently engaged in trade deals with, I believe, the US, Japan, and fellow Commonwealth realms, Australia and New Zealand. The US deal led by, well, all of them led by Liz Truss on the UK side, led by Robert Lighthizer on the US side. Based on what you've just said, Peter, are these trade deals that vital? Are they important? Do we need them? And will they offset any potential losses, which some argue we may see from Brexit?
They are important, but of second order importance, not primary importance. We will thrive and prosper perfectly well if we don't have such deals, but if we have them, it will make it a bit easier, and it'll also cement political links with those countries. Perhaps the biggest and most important, well, obviously the American deal potentially is important. If we can create essentially a transatlantic area of much freer trade in services as well as goods, open up markets for agricultural products. We're not allowed to sell lamb at the moment, and yet we're producers of the best lamb in the world. So there'll be quite considerable opportunities in America, but on top of that, becoming members, as we've been invited to, of the TPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Trade and Prosperity Partnership, which includes Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, and probably we'll do negotiations with those three first, while our application for the whole area is being considered. That'll be a tremendous coup for us if we are members, because that is one of the biggest, fastest growing markets in the world, covering both sides of the Pacific. We'll be the only non-Pacific country as a member. And again, not only will it remove some of the barriers we face at present, it will change the psychology. In Britain, people will say, gosh, we're members, let's go out and do something. They could probably do it now, but it will change the orientation and direction and energy and emphasis that British industry puts away from, not instead of, but putting the primary effort not into the slowest growing continent in the world, but to the fastest growing economies in the world. And that'll be good for us.
Yes, the EU is never the internationalist option. It's wrong to frame it as such. And of course, there's virtually nothing, I believe, the UK couldn't, that the UK gets from the EU in terms of products and services that it couldn't get from the United States and those other countries. It's interesting, Peter, you mentioned the political links, and I tend to promote the idea of the Commonwealth quite a lot, and Australia and New Zealand are two countries where the UK is currently engaged in trade deals. Do you see, you mentioned the Atlantic Partnership and the Anglosphere, we obviously have the Five Eyes Partnership you would have been aware of in government. Do you see an opportunity for post-Brexit Britain to cement its ties with the Commonwealth, particularly with countries like Canada and Australia, which arguably it sort of neglected during its time with the EU? Do you see an opportunity there?
Yes, indeed. I was invited out to New Zealand and Australia to talk about Brexit a couple of years ago after the referendum. And there was tremendous interest and a great deal of enthusiasm there. Of course, if you go to the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, it makes you think the BBC is comparatively moderate, but they were anti-Brexit, but they were astonished to believe that to hear from me that there are very good arguments for doing what we want, and that really went on. Plus, but by and large, the people of Australia, the people of New Zealand would like to reinforce the long-standing links. There may be opportunities for reaching agreements on free movement of people. You might think, why is he saying that? Since I'm not a believer in encouraging mass immigration into this country. But a free movement of people agreement between us and Australasia would not lead to mass movement of people in either direction. It would just make it a bit easier for people at either end to move back and forth, and a bit less problem when they fall in love and marry each other, which tends to happen. And one doesn't want to create undue obstacles for that. One has to with other countries where if you had free movement, it would lead to mass influx into the UK.
Now, trade deals aside, Commonwealth aside, just returning back to the negotiations, we've heard that some of the sticking points include this so-called level playing field, fishing rights, state aid rules, and of course, that may need to be revisited after the crisis. Do you think these are obstacles which can be overcome, firstly?
They certainly can be overcome. What we've put forward in terms of a draft deal is effectively written by cutting and pasting elements from deals that the EU has already done with other countries, Canada, Japan, or offered to, but it never was concluded with the US and so on. So we know that what we're asking for is things that they've previously agreed with other countries and therefore ought to be possible. Of course, they have a political imperative in dealing with us, which they don't have with all those other countries. And that's to try and make it look as if leaving the EU is painful and damaging. It isn't, of course, but they've got to try and make it look as if it is, without doing too much damage to themselves. And that's the reason why there's not an absolute certainty that we'll get a deal, because they've got to balance that political imperative against their economic self-interest in doing a deal with us. It is in their interest to do a deal with us, just as it's in our interest to do a deal with them. One can quantify that by looking what would happen if there's no deal. If there's no deal, we will have to, our exporters will have to pay the common external tariff that the EU applies to all other countries, but which at present we don't have to. And initially, their exporters would have to pay that common external tariff if we maintain those tariffs to get into our market. Now, that would cost our exporters £5 billion a year, 5.5. It would cost their exporters to us £13.5 billion a year. Why the huge disparity? Partly because they export so much more to us than us to them, which is another reason why they have a big interest in maintaining free trade with us, because we're their biggest single external market. But even more than the size of their exports, the sort of goods they export are protected goods, goods which they sell to us because we at present preclude ourselves from buying from the rest of the world except paying a tariff. So even if we reduce our tariffs and abolish our tariffs on the goods we currently import from the EU, we will then be able to buy them cheaper elsewhere, and EU companies will have to cut their prices by the level of the external tariff. So it's going to cost the Europeans £13 billion, even if we don't have a tariff barriers against them. And that's less in proportion to their economy than 5 billion is to ours, but it's serious. And if you tell German car workers, oh, sorry, you've lost your jobs because you now can't sell 20% of your cars that go to the UK, but don't worry, more British workers will have lost their jobs proportionately than German workers. They're going to say, we don't care about that. We want to keep our jobs. We're not in the business of doing harm to other people. Some people in Brussels are in the business of doing harm to us, but I think for those reasons, there hopefully will be a deal.
Peter, you mentioned the EU, and I want to speak about them before we wrap up. But I said firstly, my second question, leading on from the last one, is: do you feel in these negotiations that the UK has played its strongest hand and has put its best foot forward?
I think it has, both in terms of putting forward a concrete proposal which the EU finds it very difficult to disagree with because it's composed of things that they've agreed elsewhere, of insisting on the deadline, saying you can't prolong these negotiations indefinitely, and also of opening negotiations with other countries so that they can see. So supposing I'm over in my holiday home in France at the moment, and I love France and it's a wonderful country, but if you're a French wine grower, at present you have privileged access to the UK market. If we leave and have a free trade deal, suddenly their wines will have to compete with Australasian wines and Chilean wines without the benefit of, or without those other countries having to face pay tariffs if we have free trade deals with Australasia. If there's no deal, then it will move from French wine having tariff-free access to Britain and Australians having to pay tariffs to the reverse. So if you're a French wine grower, and it same applies to lots of other industries, you want a deal, and hopefully that will be agreed between both sides. But because we've started those other free trade agreements, it's put considerable pressure on the EU to reach a settlement.
Now, the EU has hardly covered itself in glory, Peter, during this coronavirus crisis. We had the Corona bonds debacle a few months ago, where this argument over common debt issuance, this was something supported by the hard-hit countries, mainly in Southern Europe, and something argued against by the predominantly wealthier countries in Central and Northern Europe. We've obviously now got this proposed. In addition to that, we had at times borders slamming shut within the EU. We've had medical exports being banned within the EU. Now we have this proposed Franco-German 500 billion euro bailout package. I believe that's primarily, or almost entirely, the 500 billion comprised of grants rather than loans. Something opposed by the so-called frugal four countries of Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Sweden, but something the Germans have had a bit of an 11th hour conversion to. What has been your overall assessment of how the EU and Eurozone have handled the crisis? Where do you think they are now, and what do you see as the midterm future for the bloc?
Well, as you say, the EU has, and the EU single market, which is supposedly its pride and joy, has not operated in a way that the doctrine suggests during this crisis. And the key movers have been the member states, and some have handled it well, some badly, some have faced greater problems than others. Italy initially, because it has a large Chinese population working in the textile industry, was affected before anyone else had much experience for them to learn from. So they haven't done desperately well out of it. On this loan, it can be seen possibly as a first tentative step towards collective financing. Ultimately, they're going to have to move in that direction. I think this will be just a small one step forward, and then there'll be a half step back. But they created a single currency without creating a single state. There's never been a currency in the history of the world without a government to run it, equipped with powers to tax and spend and borrow and regulate and shift money from rich areas to poor areas. And they're going to have to create such a system, otherwise the currency won't work. And they will gradually, I think, be forced in that direction. I personally don't think the euro will collapse, but more that they will be forced in that direction. That's a good reason for us to remain outside. I used to tell a story when the debates were going on about whether we should join the single currency, and the elites in Britain, of course, said it was absolutely essential and we'd all starve to death if we didn't join, same way as they did in the referendum. I told a story about a friend of mine who was in Brussels and woke up in his hotel and suddenly realized he had no razor with him. So he went down to the reception and said, "Could you sell me a razor or lend me a razor? I've got to shave." And they said, "Sorry, no, we're not allowed to sell razors, but we do have a shaving machine." And he said, "A shaving machine?" And he said, "Yes, you see that thing over there looks like one of those photo cabins. You go in there, you put your head through the hole, you put a coin in the slot, you press the coin, and it will shave you." And he said, "But that's terrifying." He said, "Surely everybody has a different size of head and a different shape of face." And they said, "Oh yes, but only the first time." And that's what the euro is like. It's shaving people into the same shape, an extremely painful process, and one I'd rather not put my country through. I'm afraid your sound has disappeared.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, I was hoping this device would work, so I hope that isn't that doesn't run problems later on, or haven't been problems with
No,
my.
up to now it's been fine.
Great. I was saying, you mentioned, I mean, I've often characterized the EU as a union without a demos. You're absolutely right to highlight the insanity of having a common currency without a common government to back it up. And you suggest that that is the direction I have to move in, a kind of federal direction. Yeah, I can already hear the Euro federalists saying, look, if it's because national politicians in the EU had to answer to national electorates that we had the problems we've had. Wouldn't it be so much easier if we had pan-European politicians answering to a pan-European electorate and moving in that federalist direction? But is that really going to happen? You've got countries, Germany, you've got Italy, you've got France, you've got Spain, 4 different languages, 4 different cultures, different histories, and crucially different identities. And there is a trust deficit in the bloc. I believe that's why we've seen problems with the Corona bonds debacle and what's going on now. Is it really feasible to move in the federalist direction, or do you think disintegration could be a possibility?
Fortunately, that's not a projection which I have to get right because we're not part of it. If I were a French politician or a German politician or whatever, I would have to. And as you say, there are tremendous obstacles to creating a single state out of diverse nations with different national identities. In a sense, it was a bit easier in the post-war period because all the member states had lost the war at some stage or other. They'd been defeated. They had not provided the protection in the greatest hour of need a country faces when it's in war that a nation sort of exists to provide its people with. And so faith in their own individual nationhoods was at a low point for the generation after the war. As the war recedes into the distance and people realize that there's never going to be another war in Europe, then maybe people will actually regain their confidence in their nationhood, and that will make it more difficult to create a United States of Europe, pretending they're all part of the same nation of Europe. But the pressures to move in that direction are enormous. The elites are wholly signed up to it. And the elites have much greater power on the continent than in a country like the United Kingdom. It's significant that the countries which have the greatest difficulty with the European project are ourselves, Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, Sweden, Denmark, the countries with the longest history of parliamentary self-government. And, 2 of them are within the EU. Others have been tried to be persuaded to join and have rejected. And we are now leaving it. National democracy with your own demos, your own group of people who say, okay, yeah, we'll accept what the majority wants, even if we happen to be, for the time being, in the minority. Those nations that are used to operating on that basis find it very difficult to cope when instead of it just being a minority in their own nation, it can be a ganging up of other nations against them. So it's going to be very difficult, but I still think the elites will drive it inexorably in that direction. And we'll be able to say all the time, well, if you don't, it's going to be economic chaos. And there will be a period of economic chaos if the euro breaks out.
It was interesting when you talk about countries with parliamentary history, and I see exactly what you're saying. Of course, I often look at the Eastern and Central European countries, former Warsaw Pact countries, and I see a bit of a semi-detached relationship with Brussels there too. Perhaps in their case, having been under dictatorship, been under tyranny, they are more sensitive than most to any a sense of being sort of told what to do. Do you see a potential split coming there? I mean, they're obviously different dynamic in Eastern and Central Europe, perhaps greater sense of cultural conservatism in those countries. Do you think there could be some split coming between East and West in the EU?
No, there'll be divisions within the EU on particular issues where they'll find that the Eastern European countries take a different line from the Western European countries and don't agree to do what the Franco-German couple, as they've always called it, which is supposed to run the place, want. So that's going to create problems for them. But I remember speaking to a Hungarian politician who is very Eurosceptic, and I said, of course, we, the United Kingdom, are an island. It makes it different for us. Now, as a result, we've grown up differently. He said, "Oh, Hungary is an island. It's an island of Hungarians surrounded by Slavs and Latins and so on. But unfortunately, we have no moat." So he felt that they would always have to go along with the EU if they, because they're effectively surrounded by it. And I think the same, for different reasons, applies to other countries. And it shouldn't, that's their problem. They're going to have to cope with these problems. They've started off on this adventure without persuading their people that that's where they're going, and constantly pretending, oh, no, we're not. We fortunately took the very wise decision in 2016 no longer to be part of it. We can wish them well and hope that they cope with this problem one way or the other with a minimum disruption to themselves, because any disruption to them will create ripples and and waves to us, but tsunamis to them.
I guess only time will tell. Peter, penultimate question. Do you see a threat of sovereign debt crises in the Eurozone?
Yes, it's inherent in the whole system that effectively the Germans have been, through the complex working of the central bank and the Target 2 system, which I won't endeavour to explain because I can never remember myself how it works for more than 10 minutes, ends up by meaning that the Germans have been lending to Southern Europeans to buy German goods. And the Southern Europeans are effectively building up debt, but they can't repay it, and effectively that's the Germans' fault. If you sell goods to people who can't really pay, then you won't get paid. Sooner or later, there's going to be have to be some recognition of that, and Germany will have to wipe out a lot of its what present look like credits on its balance sheet.
Final question. We've spoken about a lot today. We've spoken about the pandemic, the transition negotiations, trade deals, and of course the state of the EU and Eurozone. Tying all of that together, if you had one broad prediction, one broad forecast for the next 6 to 9 months, could be domestic, could be international, could be economic, could be political, what would that prediction or forecast be?
Well, certainly that the whole focus will move from tackling the virus to tackling the economic consequences of the shutdown. And the sooner we do focus on that, there will still remain problems with the virus, but we've learned that it's one that affects the elderly and the vulnerable. So let's protect the elderly and vulnerable rather than stopping the rest of the population working, producing, enjoying themselves. So if we can cope with the virus by much more targeted means, focus on the economy, then we will hopefully bring about a recovery, followed, I hope, by a recognition that Britain's got lots of problems we've got to solve. Most of all, you mentioned we've got a wonderful education, university system, best in the world, but we've got the worst system for training people who don't go to university in non-vocational, non-academic skills. We've got to tackle that. We've got a worst housing problem of any country in Europe. We've got to tackle that. We've got a big immigration problem, which feeds into both the other things. And it discourages people from training, and it means that we have to build lots more houses. So we've got to tackle that. If we tackle those 3 problems, focus on those 3 problems, we will reap the benefits of being a self-governing country.
Probably conclude our conversation conversation today, enjoyable as it has been. So, Lord Lilley, thank you for your time today.
A pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for watching. You can find out more at www.brexit-watch.org. You can also find us on Facebook and on Twitter. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time.